it's just this company that at its, in its good times, people have just really loved it, been really passionate about it. And my wife, my daughter were really into it. My daughter, as a teenager, spent just hanging out there, and that was her whole thing. Was they'd be selling, Anna Sue, handbags, but then at a price that my daughter, who's like 16, could afford, and so this whole thing of kind of like bringing design, bringing fashion to the masses, to teenagers, it's this huge achievement, and yet, things have been really tough, and sales have been declining. They peaked, during the pandemic, and they just haven't been able to get their groove back. And there've been a lot of missteps, but we wanted to sort of delve into that and look at that and go talk to them about that, and so we did in early September. And spent a lot of time researching, going back to them. But I mean, no, it's kind of a tragic story at this point. I mean, maybe they can turn it around, but they're in rough shape.
Well, you got to attend this pep rally for that was kind of the culmination of the most recent CEO's time at Target, Brian Cornell, and you spent some time with him. And his successor.
Soon to be successor. Incoming, right. Pending, right.
I was looking for the word incoming.
No, I know it's confusing.
How does he look at his time and sort of the arc of this narrative?
Well,
because there's a little bit of a disconnect.
Yeah, no, totally, Tim. Because I mean, that was the thing. It was this huge, event, 14,000, upper level, Target employees in this, 8:00 in the morning in the Target Center. The music's booming, red lights everywhere, and then, Brian Cornell, the current CEO, has been CEO since 2014, comes out, and basically, it's going to be his last time as at Target together as CEO. And, it's a big look back, at the highlights, and basically emphasizing that when he came in, he did a really good job. And, the company did turning around then. He did that. He pulled it out of Canada where they were losing money. He rebooted a bunch of stores and rebooted a lot of the store brands. The company peaked, though, in 2022. And he didn't really talk about what happened after that, except we didn't really grow. And there's all kinds of things that happened in the last couple of years that contributed to, the decline of their stock and the decline of their sales. They've had some big political controversies. They ticked off conservatives. They ticked off, liberals with their abandonment of DEI. So sort of they're kind of like a all purposes offender, and then their stores haven't been operated. Their stores have been kind of a mess. Anyway, he sort of ignores all that, and then he bursts into tears on the stage, and it's kind of like, well, wait a minute. He's announced that he's stepping down. He's not leaving, though, until January. And then his replacement and his right-hand man, who's an insider. That's not to say that, maybe he won't. That's not to say he won't work out. But it's not what investors wanted. The stock dropped, and it was this moment, kind of like, he was kind of milking this moment on stage in front of all these folks when his last couple of years have been kind of a disaster. If he'd left in 2022, he could have gone out in history as a great retail CEO, but he stuck around, and
they waived the mandatory retirement age for him a couple of times, right?
Once was enough, Carol. I think, but
was it once?
Yeah, well, still.
But I think what's fascinating, and you see this over and over again with companies, and they're in a hard place, trying to figure out their way forward. And then they just tap somebody who's been at the company for another 20, who's been there for 20 years. And I know sometimes folks are like, well, it's good you have an insider who knows it, but a lot of times what you need is an outsider.
Well, actually, and we're neglecting something here, because it's one thing to basically ignore investors and appoint consummate insiders. Some guy's been there for 22 years, but we're neglecting to mention that on top of that, Brian Cornell, the guy who a lot of people think is responsible for, who presided over, the sort of catastrophe over the last couple of years, he's not going anywhere. He's sticking around as executive chairman. And I think there are instances where, like Jeff Bezos, when it's time to they name his replacement, Andrew Jassy. I mean, he sticks around as executive chairman. It's kind of like, well, he's the founder. He's responsible for a lot of the company's success.
Yeah.
If he wants to stick around and kind of keep an eye on things and lead the strategy, fine. But when you're somebody who's had a really terrible record in the last couple of years, why are you sticking around? And why is the board
allowing it?
Yeah. Of course, he's the chairman of the board. But it just seems to speak to kind of a larger problem at Target. That the thing you mentioned at the beginning about a lack of urgency in addressing problems, and sometimes even acknowledging they have problems.
Right.
So yeah.
So when Cornell came in a little more than a decade ago,
Right.
he pulled the plug on the Canada stores, which was seen as a pretty big move.
They were all losing money.
They were all losing money.
Yeah, 133 of them.
But they hadn't been in Canada for that long.
Right.
And there were just a lot of, as you point out in the piece, a lot of execution issues.
Right,
with
exactly.
Actually,
Supply chain issues. Yeah.
Right. At what point, like the Target that you describe and that Carol describes, and the taking out all the like the takeover of the New Yorker.
It's all that stuff is, and I remember also.
What was sort of the end of that? Like, why did that era decline?
Well, all of that stuff happened, certainly for the most part, happened under I guess this CEO Bob Ulrich, who became CEO of Target in 1987. They just had about 300 plus stores. Mm-hmm. It was part of Dayton Hudson, sort of a department store company. But he basically decided that to compete with Walmart, we have to have like kind of cooler, styler products. We have to have cleaner, more well-lit stores. The execution has to be better. But he kicked off this whole thing that sort of, I won't say it culminated, but it really, really started, with the Michael Graves partnership, and that was in 1999. That resulted in the famous tea kettle, which of course we can't stop talking about. You can mention enough times in the story because it's just sort of like, it was incredible. It was a piece of art that people could buy for $34.99. But in any case, he steps down because of the retirement age limit in 2008. He's replaced by Greg Steinhoffel, who was his number two, his right-hand man, and that just didn't really work out. Even Bob Ulrich says in the story, he thinks that's the biggest mistake he ever made, but they never really
probably the worst decision in my blank blank life is what he said.
Right, fill in the right. But
Steinhoffel did not respond to requests for comment.
But so Brian Cornell comes in 2014, and after Steinhoff was ousted. And by the way, that follows the the hack, on Target, in 2013. That was. And the funny thing is, like, that's something that's happened in a lot of companies since. But at the time, it was kind of a first, and it blew everybody's minds. And he took responsibility for it, and kind of lost his job. But so Brian Cornell came in and fixed a lot of that stuff. But I think in terms of like maintaining that that stylistic edge, the edge on design, I think that kind of started to wane, and then in the pandemic, they themselves admit that they weren't really staying in touch with the consumer. People were working from home, and they weren't doing all the things they do. Was going out to consumers' homes and like looking through their makeup bags and all that stuff. They're kind of trying to do that now, and trying to make up for that. But they really lost the edge. But so to answer your question though, it's happened slowly, and then the pandemic, post-pandemic, it sort of accelerated really rapidly, the sort of decline.
I mean, I have to say, when my daughter was younger, I lived in Target. Like, I was there all the time, and sometimes I've gone back for her even today, and she's not a little one anymore.
Right.
But so what do folks say needs to be done at Target? Because I got to say, when it was in its groove, it was a pretty cool retail place.
I know. They're really successful.
Yeah, super successful. And everybody talked about Target, right? It was kind of cool. So what do outsiders or folks say needs to be done?
Well, they need to get their edge back in style and design. They say they're doing it at that. I mean, of course, the question is, they really got there in the first place in a very different kind of media, retail environment. So it's a bit of a challenge to recreate the success that they had. I mean, you can't just like I guess you could take over the New Yorker now. I don't think it would be quite the same thing. But they have that. They still have operational problems at their stores. I mean, you can go to really nice stores in the suburbs. We went to a very nice one in Edina, Minnesota, right outside of Target, where it turns out quite a few of the top Target executives, including one Michael Fiddelke, shop. So of course that place was fantastic. But or you can go to the Target down the street from where I live in Washington Heights on 181st Street.
Is everything locked up?
Yeah, and it's a mess. So how do you really? And I think there's kind of in between sort of my Target and the Target we went to, but they have to fix all that stuff. They have a bunch of unhappy employees. They have to do something there, but a lot of it is just executing at the level that they used to execute, and that they've kind of let that slide. And can they do it in 2025, 2026? It's a different world than it was in the aughts. So we'll see.